Welcome, everyone, to the first original trailer episode of Behind the Mic. Behind the Mic is a project that I've been working on for some time, and I'm excited to finally put out to the world. It's a podcast about podcasting with podcasters. So it's all very meta. It's a podcast where I will be moving forward interviewing you, some of the best podcasters in the game, to understand what drives them to start a podcast, to understand what are the best practices, what makes a great interview. Um, we'll talk about tips, tricks, challenges, fears, misconceptions, attribution. We'll talk about everything related to podcasting, and we'll hear it from the horse's mouth. Um, for those that don't know me, my name is Marti. I'm the founder and CEO of Influence Podium. I also run a podcast called Podium Stories. I started the podcast, and we'll talk about that a bit later today. And it's one of the best decisions that I've made as an entrepreneur. And I do think a lot of B2B companies and B2B executives should be thinking about starting their own podcast and being guests on other podcasts, which is something we do at the agency I run. And this is just a podcast for us to get to know a bit more of the industry, to get to know podcasters, and really know the people who are behind the mic. Usually they're the ones asking questions, and sometimes somebody asks them the questions. Today, as the first episode, it's going to be a bit different. Instead of already having the guest, my narcissism made me decide that I will be interviewed. So we have Andrea here, who will be asking a few questions. So we'll talk together since she's been involved in terms of how we utilize Podium Stories, what are some of the benefits that come from that. And I'm thinking that if we're going to ask podcasters to share, we should be the ones that share first. So Andrea, thank you for being here, and I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Marty. It feels good. And let me just extend a huge hello to anyone who's tuning in.
Absolutely. So, like I was saying, I think the first thing that I want to go over, Andrea, would probably be about Podium Stories. I think we should give the listeners a bit of context on that. So Podium Stories, just to give you guys a bit more context on what that is interview-based podcast where we interview mostly executives and B2B CEOs, but we've interviewed other marketers, we've interviewed salespeople as well, to hear the stories that happen behind the scenes, right? When we watch normal interviews, when we read Forbes, when we read Fortune 500, Think Magazine, it seems like everybody's world is great and roses and everything's perfect. And I was very frustrated when I started the podcast because my business wasn't that like that. So I was very surprised when I realized that just because people say that everything is great on those interviews, maybe their world isn't that ideal, as they say. So I thought that entrepreneurs, founders, we needed a podcast where we could hear the reality. We could take the pink color glasses off for a second and really understand what's going on and actually hear some of the stories that are happening, the good, the bad, the not so good, the pretty and the ugly. I call it Forbes, but with cuss words, because I try to bring that Forbes guest to an actual more real interview. And those are the topics we discuss. Just mostly stories that have happened so that other entrepreneurs can learn from them.
Absolutely. It seems like a great time to ask you the question, like, how did you actually decide to start this podcast, this show? What was the big reason behind it?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's like I planned it myself. I actually started the show pretty early on in my career. There were a couple of reasons. One of them was because I didn't have any network and I needed to find a way, and people would not take meetings with me. So I would ask people for 30 minutes of their time just so I could learn from them or build connections. and they're busy. That say, maybe in 4 months, but I'm doing stuff, and of course, I needed to understand. So I needed to find an excuse, a way in on those people that would allow me to build real, honest relationships. Actually, have a and when I say a network, I don't mean networking on the old-fashioned style. I mean actual building relationships with people and caring about each other and making friends. That's what networking really is. Um, so I just needed to find an excuse, and podcasting was the perfect in on those people. So if I, instead of asking them for 20 minutes or 30 minutes to pick their brain, I'd ask them to come into the show and discuss their main area of expertise. The conversion rate was incredibly high. I remember the first time I sent 10 pitches to people to come in, I think 8 of them said yes. And that was mind blowing. I was expecting one, maybe. That left me busy for 2 weeks. So the reason I said it was because I was early 20s from Spain. I was living 10,000 miles away from my prospects. I barely ever met an entrepreneur before, and I needed to find a way to take that and switch it up into a positive. The actual idea of the show was inspired by this online media company in the United States called the Players Tribune. That what they do is they put out content around athletes in a way that I've never seen before. So just like athletes, when they're in a post-game interview, they always give the same answers, right? They always say, credit to the other team. Our coach made great adjustments, but inside they're thinking, fuck the other team. Our coach sucks. My teammates are the worst, and I need help. But they never say that. The Players Tribune gave them the space to actually say things. So you have athletes that write for that. They made it long-form documentaries. So my idea was to turn that into the business world. I don't think we're there yet, but long-term, that's where I see it coming. So that combination of I need to build a better network, and I love that format that the Players Tribune does, was the combination that eventually turned into Podium Stores.
Fantastic. It sounds great to me, especially your idea that you wanted to create a safe space for them to actually be vulnerable and talk about the real shit, right, that goes on, below the deck. So I just wanted to know, like, looking back at your beginnings, what was your biggest initial challenge that you have faced? Like, was it something technical, people-wise, communication-wise? What was it? Was it a smooth sailing or a bumpy ride?
I'd say it was a bumpy ride at the beginning. I'd say that the biggest challenge was not understanding how simple it is to start a podcast, or how easy it can be, right? There's a lot more to it, but once you understand the concept, it's pretty straightforward. What I mean by that is, as I was saying, I'm inspired by the Players Tribune, and their documentaries are amazing, right? Like they put out these 5-10 minute videos of players. They have the best cameras, they have the best sound, best lighting. It's amazing. And I thought that I had to create something like that. Eventually, I found out that they had raised about $50 million, right? And I'm just a 22-year-old kid in a bedroom in Spain. So for the first episode, I remember I did it here with an entrepreneur from Barcelona, and he asked me if we were going to do it through Zoom. This was all pre-pandemic, and I figured that it would be a good idea to do it live, to actually bring a videographer, go to his office, all that. I spent a bit of money, and we showed up, and on those way to Barcelona to do that interview, I literally was shaking of how nervous I was. I thought, Marti, it's one of those ideas that sounds great, but you shouldn't do. You should have thought before doing that, just to spend money, turn around, don't go. So that first episode was quite hard, especially all the way until it got there. Once we sat down with the with a podcast guest than it's just having a conversation with people. So I'd say the two biggest challenges looking back is overthinking the technicalities of starting a podcast and overcoming that introversion that I have and being comfortable doing uncomfortable things. The first interview was the hardest. The next 10 were hard. The next 30 were really easy. And I feel like that happens with everything. So over time, it gets easier. But at the beginning, it was definitely a bumpy ride.
Well, thank you for sharing this, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Just things we typically overcomplicate things in our head, right? It's always like we exude this horror that things would go wrong, but actually all we need to do is just take the initial step and give ourselves time to evolve, right? So you went through this whole road, like I suppose for 2 years of running a podcast. Looking back, what would you say was the biggest benefit that you received from actually initiating into all of this?
Yeah, I think there's multiple. The biggest one in a company standpoint, right? Because this podcast sponsored by my company. We obviously don't have outside sponsors. Every money that goes there is money out of my pocket. Is ROI. Like really, it's been a great ROI investment. We close about 10% of the podcast. We have about 50 episodes. We've closed 5 clients from that. But the podcast was never intended to close clients. The podcast was intended to make friends, really. So I'd say one of the biggest benefits has been what I started the podcast for, which is building that network, but building that network in a very deep way. So I remember having, for example, a conversation with an agency CEO out of New York, who we talked about how our mothers meant the world to us and how everything that we achieved came from them. And this is someone I just met. And 20 minutes in, we're having super in-depth conversation that kind of bonded us for life. 2 weeks later, I'm having another conversation with another agency owner, and we talked about how his father died when he was 18 and how important it had been for him to recover from that mentally, and what's the role of us as guys and avoiding toxic masculinity but still being competitive. A year later, after that episode, I'm having lunch with him in an Italian restaurant in New Jersey, and we're just talking business like he's a big brother for me. So those experiences, and like those experiences I've had maybe 10, 15, 20. So those are the moments that I take away. I like this moment of vulnerability, this moments of sharing something with somebody, and turning that into an actual relationship who will be friends for life and will have each other's back. I think that's one of the things that I'll always get out of it, and nobody can take away from me. As a side final benefit, I'd say that it's given me the satisfaction of I'll never be broke again, because if for whatever reason Influence Podium crashes or something happens, I have 40, 50 people who I can call and say, hey, I need your help, right? Invest in Influence Podium so we survive, or what should we do with that? So having just a trusted bunch of people that trust me, I trust them, and they're on my back pocket on my phone, it's an added benefit from it. But overall, I'd say it's been the best investment I've made as an agency owner, and something that I want to do more.
That's a great answer, and thank you for sharing that. It's just, most people strive for perfection, but what we really want is realness.
Exactly.
Right? Having someone to talk to and to open to, it sounds perfect to me. But like, you have interviewed dozens and dozens of guests, and I know this is a hard question, but if you could boil down all of your experience into one ideal guest, how would that person behave? I guess what I'm asking is, what makes a great guest?
That's a great question. I'd say it boils down Um, if I had to put it into an equation, um, I'd make it a three-factor combination where the two values at the beginning are more important, and that the third value is necessary, but I don't think it's that important. The first value would be domain expertise, right? So if I'm interviewing you, it's because you've achieved something, are achieving something, you're doing something, you're working towards something, and you know something that I don't know. So having, and it doesn't have to be a specific area of expertise. Like you don't have to be a paid ads expert, but you have to be an expert in either your life. You've had to make mistakes. You've had to be going through the journey. So having something to say, right? That's what domain expertise comes down to. Then the second element to it, I believe, is radical transparency. That's what I call it. So if you have something to say, but you don't want to tell me, or you don't want to tell the audience because you're afraid that you're sharing your secrets, or you're afraid of being ridiculed, or you're not comfortable with that, then having something to say doesn't even matter. So I've had guests where they're like, I don't want to disclose that. And I'm like, the whole point of jumping on the podcast is to disclose that stuff. I'm not even asking you for revenue numbers or anything like that. I'm asking you for a situation where you didn't feel comfortable, or what was the biggest challenge of the first year. So just having that full transparency and wanting to share, I think is important. And then the final element to it is the ability to communicate that, right? Because if you have something to say, you're okay with saying it, but then you have to say it well. So verbal communication skills, I think, are especially helpful, just to make sure your message is transparent in the way you want to. So a lot of the entrepreneurs that I interview are introverted. The vast majority of them have figured out how to communicate in public. A few of them are still struggling with that, which is okay, and I totally understand because I've been there. But I think those three factors of having something to say, aka domain expertise, radical transparency, and communication skills, I think makes a great guest. So you put that into someone, and if you the host, don't fuck it up, the guest will do amazing.
Awesome answer. Okay, so this puts a lot of pressure on the guest, but we know that a great interview is actually more of a tango, right? Mm-hmm. So you need to be vibing with the guest. So what do you do to ensure a great interview, or if you'd like to share some secrets to a great interview with our audience?
Yeah, I think this is the key. And this is something I'm still trying to figure out. One of the reasons why I started this podcast is to understand what makes a great conversation, right? A great interview. I think part of it comes, from my experience, comes down to what environment do you create for the guest to share. So are you creating a safe space where the guest feels comfortable sharing and feels that you have his back? It's easier when you're interviewing somebody that you already know, they're a friend, but where you're interviewing somebody that you've never met before and you have 30 minutes to do this call and they might be nervous, it's your job to put them at ease and make them understand that this is that you're with them, that you're not trying to attack them, that you're just wanting to get a good conversation going. I think the first 5 minutes of the show are extremely important. And even more important than that, for 3 minutes before the camera is turned on. So usually I'll start by talking to the guest 3 to 4 minutes before the camera is even on and recording, and just try to relate with them in some way. Just find what I call a trigger, something that my research has showed that we have in common, and deploy that very early on. So if they played basketball, I'll go for basketball. If they lived in New York and I'm moving to New York, I'll go for that. Just finding a trigger to find a connection and then building from it, I think is important. And then I think of it as knowing your own style. So there's some guests, some podcast hosts that will be they'll speak as much as the guest, right? It's a 50-50. There's some podcast hosts that they just have to ask questions, they give you the room, they go from there. My style is more somewhere in the middle. Uh, I don't want you to be only answering questions like we're doing a test, but also you're a guest for a reason. I'm not. Uh, so checking my ego, letting you speak, um, and then knowing where to add, when to add to the conversation, and finding that right timing is important. So knowing your style, knowing how much you're going to talk, it's an element. And that's where I would say makes a great interview. At the end of the day, once you do it more and more and more, you start to find trends, and you start. It seems like it slows down, so you have more time to react, and you see where things are going. You think if a question made the guest uncomfortable, so you switch it up. You see how you're running out of time. So just the more practice you get, obviously the interviews get better. But these are some of the things that I recommend to make sure you're having good enough interviews.
Awesome. Like listening you speak about this, I see there's a huge correlation like with the entertainment business, like knowing your pace, right? Being able to connect with your audience. This whole thing, like it reminds me of like a stand-up comedy show, or I don't know, a music show or something where you're there for the audience, but you're the one who's behind the wheel.
Well, so, it's a bit like an act, right? Like you're saying, a conversation is a beautiful thing. And I'm somebody that doesn't love conversations with strangers. Like my dad, for example, will go out to like get a coffee, and then after 10 minutes, he'll be talking to the tables on the side, right? I'm more of like, put my headphones on, I'll put a snapback ahead, and don't talk to me. I don't want to talk to you. Just leave me alone. So it was hard for me to transition that into exploring how to have good conversations. I think one of the benefits now looking back, and I didn't think about this before, is I'm a better conversationalist because of this, right? I can speak to more people. I can be on a sales call, and these are experiences that have made me comfortable now with doing that. And then in a conversation, I think it's like a relationship. There's parts where it requires a lot of you. There's times where it doesn't require much from you, and it's about them. There's podcast guests that will come and will speak, and then you just have to check in your ego and shut up because they're doing amazing. There's podcast guests where you're like, I think you need some help, buddy. Let me help out. So reading the situation, not doing it one way, and playing it by ear, intuition, and understanding what a conversational is, and that it's not for you, like you're saying, it's for the audience. These are all some good tips, I think, to make a conversation happen. But yeah, that's a beautiful topic to explore, right? What's a good conversation? I think on the next few episodes, we'll be talking more about that with the podcast host.
That was a very good answer, and I think that it was your introversion that actually made you a great host, right? How we think of extroverted people, like you would typically place them in a position of being a podcast host, but actually it's your ability to listen and to empathize, which are, dominantly traits of more introverted people with their, earpods in their head all the time. That's, I think, an untapped resource for most people who are thinking about this.
I agree. I'm not saying I'm the best at it, because sometimes I'm like, you should stop talking there, or but I do think I do a pretty good job here. There's a lot of things that I don't do a good job. I think shutting up, letting them do the talk is one of the things that I can do well. But yeah, I think being an introverted can help, right? Because you are naturally inclined to not overspeak on them, to know when's your place, and then you're able to read that situation and play from there, right? Like you do in basketball. Again, I hate to do sports analogies, but you can run a play where you know where you're supposed to go, and then you're fixed and you have to go there. I don't think that's what a conversation is. Conversation is more free flowing. You read what the defense gives you, and then you play from there. So yeah, different styles to different people. Some hosts do it in another way, but that's how I personally have found to have the best conversations and episodes.
Awesome. This brings us to our last question for today, and I just love this one. If you could interview anyone, dead or alive, or maybe even a fictional character, right? Who would that person be and why?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this question, and I had, you know, the normal answers like Kobe Bryant, who's an athlete who passed away, and um, I had a few ideas there. I think there are two people that I love to sit down with and chop it up. Um, I think, other than the mainstream ones, I'd say. One of them is an author called Hunter S. Thompson. Hunter S. Thompson, he wrote Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. He wrote Hell's Angels. He's the starter of gonzo journalism, which is a type of journalism where instead of putting the story at the center, you put yourself at the center and the story happens around you. So his writing is incredible. His lifestyle seemed to be super hedonistic, doing cocaine at 3 a.m. and going to sleep at 9 a.m. and doing a bunch of weird stuff. So I just think it would be a good conversation to have. Just sit down, chop it up, and just learn from him. And he's a way to communicate, make an impact through writing. His books are a pleasure to read. They're wild. It's like riding a roller coaster, but on a book. It's insane. So that'd be one. The second one is a bit more emotional. I like to interview my grandfather, just so that we could sit down again. He passed away when I was a senior in high school, I believe. And we had a lot of conversations, so it's not like I missed out on anything, but it would just be good to, I guess, see him again. And now I would love to listen more to the conversations and the stories that he used to tell. I used to make fun of him for telling so many stories and all that stuff. Now I actually pay attention to what he was saying. So that would be my other podcast guest. Probably not at the same time because my grandfather would hate Hunter S. Thompson, but separately, two different episodes.
Awesome answer. Thank you so much, Marti. I think we have reached the end of this podcast, and you have been a wonderful guest, especially with this last bit. You actually exemplified the openness and the vulnerability and the things that we all believe that B2B CEOs or CEOs in general would lack, right?
Yeah, thanks for coming in. I think this podcast as a whole is going to be very interesting. It's a personal project of mine, so I appreciate you being part of it. If you liked this episode, you'll like the next episodes more because they're with better guests than myself. And I think it's going to be an interesting topic. I understand this is not a super mainstream topic to discuss and talk about, but if you want to learn more from podcast hosts, if you want to learn more about the industry, if you want to hear the stories behind the people that usually are asking questions, I think this is going to be a good show.
Definitely is. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Andrea.